بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. Welcome back everyone to another class in our reading of this great book Lub al-Usul of Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah. So today we enter into book 6, chapter 6, which is called At-Ta'adul wa-Tarajih, or which I translate as giving preference to proof. So this chapter, which will occupy this lecture and most likely the next two, so 3 lectures to do this book, is what happens when we have proofs that seem to be in conflict or seem to be at equal strength but are in conflict. Can they be in conflict? Is it an assumed conflict or not? When we transmit the madhab of our imam, what happens when we find if the imam has more than one position? How do we know which is the correct position? Do we transmit both? What happens if the imam forgot something based on his principles? Can we attach that to his position? So on and so forth. So that's why I call it giving preference to proof. Sometimes it's known as ta'arud al-adilla, when the proofs are in conflict with one another. So this chapter, this book, will teach us how we give preference. What's the order of the arguments? We learned in the past the theory of how we arrive at a position. Obviously, based on that, you can see there's many instances where different mujtahids will come up with different positions, and even within the same madhab. So in this book, we want to look at how we deal with that, which one is stronger than another. So in today's lecture, we're going to do the introductory section right before the issue. I think he has just one issue, one mas'ala that he talks about in the book to the end of the chapter. That will take 2 lectures. So today we're just going to do the introductory remarks, which will introduce the concept. We'll look at the theory, what can contradict what cannot contradict what, and what happens specifically with Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, in which we have some things he was not clear on, or some things that we want to extrapolate from him. And then we will look at what is the generic order of how we give order to the different positions that we have. So those are the main things that we'll talk about. We'll begin the discussion inshallah in the next lecture, in the next clip. Okay, so we begin the way we normally begin, to say Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. قال المصنف رحمه الله ونفعنا بعلومه في الدارين آمين. So Shaykh al-Islam Zakaria al-Ansari rahimahullah, he says, may Allah Ta'ala have mercy on him and may we benefit from his knowledge in this world and in the next. Kitabu Sadis fi التعادل والتراجيح. So book 6, giving preference to proofs. So he says rahimahullah, يمتنع تعادل القاطعين. So right off the bat, so he's giving you a huge important principle. It is impossible for 2 absolute texts to contradict one another. So the reason that is the case is, it's kind of a little bit important that we understand what's going on here. It's kind of like a philosophical point. So if we have 2 absolute texts, 2 verses in the Quran, let's say, there can't be an opposition, because where does the Quran come from? What is the dalil or the adillah that is behind the Quran? Well, it's kalamullah al-qadim, it's Allah's eternal uncreated speech. So obviously it's impossible. It's a theological impossibility that there be a contradiction between them. And that's why the whole science of usul al-fiqh was codified and exercised, and all of the sects of Islam deal with it, because we need to understand, well, we all agree that this is the revelation, and we all agree that the Prophet ﷺ is ma'soom, وَمَا يَنْطِقُ عَنِ الْهَوَىٰ إِنْ إِلَّا هُوَ وَحْيٌ يُوحَىٰ. So therefore, what happens when we have a mutawatir hadith that's 2 mutawatir hadith that quote unquote seem to be in opposition? So right off the bat, the first rule is it's impossible that there's a contradiction between them. So that means something else is happening. It could be nasikh and mansukh, it could be abrogation, it could be mutlaq and muqayyad, it could be kulli and juz'i, it could be a whole host of things. As we've been reading throughout the text, by now it's clear that there are many things that it could be. But what it cannot be is it cannot be a contradiction. And then he says, لا قطعي وظني نقليين, but not an absolute text and a partial text received through transmission. So that there could be a contradiction in something like that. because one text is absolute and the other text is partial. She says one is qat'i and one is dhanni. Naqliyaini, meaning that they come through transmission. Al-naqli is in juxtaposition to al-aqli. So we have al-ulum al-aqliya, we have the rational sciences, the Arabic sciences, grammar, morphology, rhetoric, prosody, is it called? Al-urud. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And logic. Obviously, logic is rational. But then we have al-naqliya, al-ulum al-naqliya. We have the transmitted sciences. Most of the classes that we are doing in the university are transmitted sciences. Fiqh, usul, tafsir, hadith, tasawwuf, usul al-fiqh, usul al-din, so on and so forth. So he says when it comes to the transmitted, because they come through the process of transmission, and one is absolute, one could be absolute if it's mutawatir or if it's a Quranic verse, and then all of the other things, what is below that, ma duna dhalik, what is below that is going to be dhanni, it's going to be partial. So obviously there can be a contradiction in those, in that makeup. وكذا أمارتان في الواقع في الأصح فإن تعادلتا فالمختار التساقط. It is likewise possible for two commands to be equal in the dominant opinion. If they are equal, the chosen opinion is to leave them both and search for another. So you can have two commands that might seem to be in opposition to one another, to do something and to not do something, because they are going to come from a source. So you have to understand what he's saying and connect it to what is the source of the command. Well, the source of a command is going to be some kind of dalil, some kind of proof from the Quran or the Sunnah. And we just said if something is absolute and something is partial, they can be in contradiction. So therefore, two commands could be in contradiction. Now, even though he's making it seem there's a lot of contradiction, the goal of the mujtahid is to reconcile all of these differences. So this is the process of tahqiq. So when you read like a debate, nothing comes to mind right now, but you read like a debate about an issue, you read like Fulan said this and Fulan said that and Ailan said that and Tirkan said that, but then وَقَالَ الْمُحَقِّقُونَ, but then those who did tahqiq said, meaning that there are a select group of people that this issue bothered them so much they're going to analyze it and dice it and splice it and say, no, this is how we can reconcile between the two adillah. So we do not like, as Muslims, we do not like to leave the adillah on the table. We try our best to reconcile between them. And that's again why usul al-fiqh is so important, because sometimes we reconcile and be like, oh, this is really an application for this scenario, and this is really an application for that scenario. So there really is no contradiction. You'll find that very, very frequently. When people reconcile the hadith, when people reconcile obscure hadith with theological principles, well, what does it really... Okay, I'll give you an example. We believe in Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, we believe that the parents of the Prophet ﷺ are saved, and not only that, but the entire nasab, the entire lineage of Rasulullah ﷺ, from him all the way back to Adam alayhi salam, were pure monotheists. وَلِدْتُ مِن نِكَاحٍ وَلَمْ أُولِدْ مِن سِفَاحٍ. The Prophet ﷺ said, I was born out of marriage and I was not born from adultery. None of the filth of the jahiliyyah touched my nasab. And then we have the verse in the Quran, وَتَقَلُّبَكَ فِي السَّاجِدِينَ. Allah Ta'ala causes your genetic material to pass from one sajid, from one pious person to another. So that's like a principle. So therefore, when we find a hadith, Abi wa abak finnar, my father and your father in the hellfire, or some sort of thing, we know that therefore it cannot mean that the parents of the Prophet are in the hellfire. So therefore we have to reconcile between it, and we have to find an alternative tafsir, an alternative interpretation to make them fit together. So we don't discard one, we make them fit together. So I want you to keep that in mind. Even though he's not explicitly saying that, I want you to understand that that's what's happening behind the scenes in order to put these pieces together. So let me just read this last section. It is likewise possible for two commands to be equal in the dominant opinion. If they are equal, the chosen opinion is to leave them and search for another. So if you find two commands that are equal that might be in opposition, we're going to put them to the side and we're going to look for a third dalil or a third pathway to help us reconcile between the two. That's what I'm talking about, the process of tahqiq. Okay. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَإِن نُقِلَ عَنْ مُجْتَهِدٍ قَوْلَانِ فَإِن تَعَاقَبَ فَالْمُتَأَخِرُ قَوْلُهُ وإلا فما ذكر فيه مشعرا بتراجيحه وإلا فهو متردد. Now we are going to talk about inside a school of thought. If two opinions are attributed to a mujtahid, which happens very, very frequently, by the way, if they oppose one another, which also happens, then the correct opinion is the latter one. If two opinions don't oppose one another, then the one that the mujtahid indicated is correct. If he did not, then the correct position is between the two. Okay, so there's a lot of things going on there. So here, the scenario is, let's just think about like Imam Shafi'i, radiallahu anhu, because that's our madhab. Imam Shafi'i, in the narration of his madhab, he has two positions on this issue. Sometimes we refer to it as al-madhab al-qadim and al-madhab al-jadid, the old school and the new school. Sometimes he's debating himself, or he's offering in his writings, it could be this, it could be that. So maybe in a specific instance, and he'll come and say that there are about 15 to 17 of these cases, we'll say that, we received from the transmission of the madhab these two positions, but we're not really sure which one he preferred. Did he indicate? So if we know that one came after the other, so 1 year he said A, and then 5-6 years later he said B, then in that case B will have been an abrogation of A. So the chronological order of the madhab, or of the statement of the mujtahid, is taken into account to verify which one is the correct opinion. So that could happen, and that has happened in the Shafi'i madhab specifically. We know, and even non-Shafi'is know this example. We have al-madhab al-qadim and al-madhab al-jadid, and in all but a few cases, the new school abrogates the old school. If the two opinions don't oppose one another, then the one that the mujtahid indicated is correct. And I see that I'm running out of time, so with your permission, I'll pick up this discussion with a little bit of a backtrack in the next clip. So we ended in the last clip, we were talking about what happens if in our imam, in this case we're using Imam Shafi'i as an example, what happens if from our imam we have multiple, let's just keep it simple, two opinions. If we know the order of the opinions, then the latter opinion abrogates the previous opinion. In other words, if he said that you can't do this, and then later he said you can do this, now they're in opposition, but we know the chronological order, the latter one abrogates the former one. If the two opinions don't oppose one another, okay, so there's just two opinions of the madhab, of the imam rather, but they not oppose one another, then which one do we say is the correct one? The one that the mujtahid indicated is correct. So in the commentary he says, so he could say like هذا أشبه, this is more likely, or هذا أرجح, this is more correct, or أميل إلى ذلك, or I incline towards this, or أراه حسنا, or I see that it is okay. Those type of phrases that you would make it seem like, okay, we don't know the chronology of these opinions, because sometimes the opinions happen in a class setting and the students are writing it down and the imam is saying both at the same time. But then you can find some kind of phraseology that will tell you that the imam is leaning towards this or that. If we have that, then that's the correct answer that's attributed to that imam. So if the two opinions don't oppose one another, then the one that the mujtahid indicates is correct. If he did not, then the correct position is between the two. There is taraddud, and that's where the work of the madhab takes place. That's the engine of the madhab through time, is that the followers of the madhab do that. They're going to go in and be like, okay, we know the imams, if we're Shafi'i, that means that we follow the ijtihad principles laid down by Imam Shafi'i, which is what we're studying right now. So we're going to take these tools that are the tools of Imam Shafi'i to be faithful to his effort, And we're going to go back on this issue using his tools and say, okay, we don't know the chronology of this issue. He did not indicate which one he is right. They are a little bit in opposition, or they could be seen to be in opposition. So using his own methodology, let us see if we can extrapolate what is the correct position. And that's why within the madhab we have different positions. And in the madhab we have different imams of the madhab that conclude different things. And that's why another layer is that you have to have the tanqih of the madhab. You have to have somebody that will come later, like a Shafi'i, a Rafi, and then a Shafi'i, radiallahu anhuma, that will say, no, this is the correct, we prefer this, we prefer that. And then that takes place later with al-Ramli and al-Haytami and so on and so forth. And Shaykh al-Islam himself, Zakir al-Ansari, had a position in the latter school. Okay, and then he says, وَوَقَعَ لِلشَّافِعِيِّ رَضِيَ اللَّهُ عَنْهُ فِي بِدْعَةِ عَشْرَةَ مَكَانًا. And this occurred to Imam Shafi'i in about 10 instances. In the commentary he says 16 or 17, as indicated by Qadi Abu Hamid that's very difficult to pronounce, Al-Marwaruthi, radiallahu anhu. He died in the year 362. And then Al-Isfariyini, Abu Hamid Al-Isfariyini, rahimahullah, one of the great jurists of the Iraqi branch of the madhab, he died in the year 406. So Al-Isfariyini from the Iraqi Shafi'i, let me read it. ثم ووقع للشافعي رضي الله عنه في بدعة عشرة مكانا ثم قيل مخالف أبي حنيفة أرجح من موافقه وقيل عكسه. And then Al-Isfariyini from the Iraqi Shafi'is, I lifted this from the commentary of course, said that the correct position of those 10 are the ones that oppose Abu Hanifa, because that's what he was doing. I mean, Imam Shafi'i came after the madhab of Imam Abu Hanifa and Imam Malik. Now, Imam Shafi'i was a Maliki by every definition of the word. In other words, he was a Maliki, he did taqleed of the madhab, he was a mufti of the madhab, he used to teach the madhab, he used to give fatwa based on the madhab, but he was not a Hanafi. So when he left the circle of Imam Malik radiallahu anhu, and then he ended up going to Baghdad several times, I think it was 3 times in his life, and extended periods of time, at that point, that's when he began to formulate his own school. So he takes like the Maliki madhab and kind of like diverges, but he never rides the Hanafi madhab. So that's why we know that these are the positions that he has as opposed to the positions of Imam Abu Hanifa radiallahu anhu and the 2 Imams, Abu Yusuf and Shaybani radiallahu anhuma. So Al-Isfariyini, which was a great member of the great jurist of the great figure of Islam first and foremost, and then secondarily of the Iraqi Shafi'is, he said that the correct position of those 10s are the ones that are in opposition to Abu Hanifa, while others said it was the opposite, and that was confirmed by Imam al-Nawawi, meaning that the ones in which he agreed with Abu Hanifa are the correct positions. So right off the bat, you see that there's a difference of opinion inside the madhab, and of course, because we're like very late in the game, we follow the tarjih of Imam al-Nawawi radiallahu anhu, keeping in mind, I mean, it's not hermetically sealed and bound. I mean, these 10 or 15, I apologize, they're not fresh in my mind at the moment. There is wiggle room. In other words, there's a khilaf, or ikhtilaf, we should say, inside the madhab. And there's a khilaf inside the madhab, and therefore there could be situations and fatwas where you were going to follow one or the other. But the default, like if we're going to ask a question on an exam or something like that, we're going to go with the tarjih, preferences of Imam al-Nawawi radiyallahu anhu. وَالْأَصَحُّ التَّرْجِيحُ بِالنَّظَرِ فَإِنْ وَقَفْ فَالْوَقْفُ. The correct position is to confirm by analyzing. Okay, so you got to analyze all of these things. If one cannot, then an opinion or preference is taken. So you got to prefer one to the other if you're not unable to find the correct answer purely through the process of analyzing. And then he says, rahimahullah, وَإِن لَمْ يُعْرَفْ لِلْمُجْتَهِدِ قَوْلٌ في مسألة لكن في نظيرها فهو قوله فالمخرج فيها في الأصح. If a particular mujtahid, and let's just keep in your mind Imam al-Shafi'i just to make the class make sense. If a particular mujtahid is not known to have a position on a particular legal issue, but does have one on a similar legal issue, then one extrapolates in the dominant opinion. So, this is like qiyas inside the madhab. Okay, so qiyas in Islam is that the sharia, meaning the Quran and the Sunnah, have are limited in their numeric output. In other words, maybe that was not very elegantly stated. In other words, there's only 6,236 verses. There's not like infinite verses. And there's only about 100 to 120,000 hadith texts in all of their variants and all of their strengths. So they're mahdud. I mean, there's a number, you can count them. But then the situations that we face in life are never ending, right? That's how we introduced analogy. So therefore, qiyas is to see the nadir, to see the similar instance outside to the text that we have. Like the date and grape alcohol, the famous example is haram because of the intoxication, that's the illah. So there are other drinks that have intoxicating properties, ethanol, alcohol, so that illah exists there, so the same hukm exists. That can also happen inside the madhab, right? That Imam al-Shafi'i radiallahu anhu, he was only human and he only lived so many years, so he was silent about a whole host of things, but there are things in which he is similar. They're similar to it, so you can extrapolate based on that. But the extrapolation happens from the ashab, happens from the followers of the madhab. I mean, the people after him, obviously, because Imam Shafi'i is passed, radiallahu anhu. And then the dominant position is that we say, this is the Shafi'i position on this issue, because then that becomes a debate. Well, if Imam Shafi'i radiallahu anhu himself did not say it, does that mean that we can follow it, or it is his opinion, or is it something else? So the dominant position, as you would expect, is look, he said it very similar, and if you can do qiyas in based on what Allah and the Prophet are saying, certainly we can do qiyas on something that Imam Shafi'i said, rahimahullah. So let me just read that section again to end this clip. The correct position, if a particular mujtahid is not known to have a position on a particular legal issue, but does have one on a similar legal issue, then one extrapolates in the dominant opinion. So the dominant opinion is that we extrapolate and then we attach that position to Imam Shafi'i, and in the next clip we'll talk about how can you attach that to the Imam, and then we'll finish the discussion for this lecture, inshallah. And then he says, رضي الله رحمه الله رضي الله عنه, of course, والأصح لا ينسب إليه مطلقا بل مقيدا ومن معارضة نص آخر للنظير تنشأ الطرق. And the dominant position is not to attribute this position to the Imam absolutely, but partially. So in the previous clip we said we're doing like kind of intra-madhab qiyas. Is that right? Intra or inter? I think it's inter-madhab qiyas, because this is qiyas inside one madhab. Inter-madhab qiyas. And then Imam Shafi'i was silent about a position, radiallahu anhu, but it looks like something else that he said. We're going to extrapolate. So the question is, do we say then this is absolutely Imam Shafi'i's position or not? He says you can't say it absolutely. There has to be an issue of a nisba, a percentage of partiality in that attaching. If this extrapolation opposes another text to the similar legal issue, two opinions have been developed. And that's how you get multiple opinions inside the madhab. So, let me just read the last couple sentences back to back so we have them. If a particular mujtahid is not known to have a position on a particular legal issue, but does have one on a similar legal issue, then one extrapolates in the dominant opinion. And the dominant opinion is not to attribute this position to this Imam absolutely, but partially. If this extrapolation, meaning the new issue that we've added to the madhab, if it opposes another text to a similar legal issue, then two opinions have been developed. in which case you have to prefer one over the other. So something has gone wrong, or not wrong, but now we have a new issue, a new legal issue that we have to deal with. And then he says, radiallahu anhu, rahimahullah, الترجيح تقوية أحد الدليلين. To prefer one proof or another, tarjih, that's the definition of tarjih, is to prefer one proof or the other, is to find one stronger. So one imam says, I feel that this evidence is stronger than this. A is stronger than B, for a whole host of reasons. And then another mujtahid says, I feel that B is more stronger than A. Imam Abu Hanifa understood al-qur' in the Quran, ثلاثة قروء, to be one meaning, and he leaned towards that. Imam Shafi'i understood it to be another meaning, leaned towards that. Both of them are based on the linguistic meaning of al-qar', that it is a time period either of the menstrual cycle or after the menstrual cycle. But you have to prefer one, or you can't go with both at the same. Both at the same time can't happen. It has to be one or the other in that case. And that's what tarjih is. وَالْعَمْلُ بِالرَّاجِحِ وَاجِبٌ فِي الْأَصَحِ. In the dominant opinion, one must act on the stronger proof. Well, obviously, if you're a mujtahid and you've come to the conclusion that this is stronger, you can't abandon that because it's not cool, or you're afraid of what people are going to say. As long as inside you have come to the conclusion that this is stronger, you must follow it. And this is why tasawwuf and is a critical part of ijtihad, and that's why the book ends with tasawwuf. And I've said that before in these recordings, is that it's part of the same spectrum. The same effort that creates the mujtahid is the same effort that creates the Sufi, creates the tasfiyat of the qalb, the purification of the heart. ولا ترجيح في القطعيات. There is no preference in absolute texts because they're qat'i, so you don't prefer one verse in the Quran over another. Like when people say, oh, what's your favorite verse in the Quran? I mean, it's a very problematic question for a Muslim. Like, we don't have favorite verses. I mean, I have one that I frequently recite, or in a certain situation I recall a certain set of verses. You can say that, but I can't prefer one over the other. I can't say I like this verse, I like Ayat al-Kursi more than I like the third verse of Surah Tawbah or something like that. I mean, it doesn't work like that. وَالْمُتَأَخِّرُ نَاسِخٌ وَإِن نُقِلَ بِالْآحَادِ. The latter text abrogates even if transmitted singularly. So inside the madhab, we're also concerned with the chronology, which is why one of the conditions for a madhab to be a madhab is it has to be transmitted. I mean, the four Sunni madhabs have been transmitted by tawatur. I mean, there's no question to the veracity that these were the positions held by the people called, the actual human being, Abu Hanifa, Imam Malik, Imam Shafi'i, Imam Ahmad ibn Hanbal radiallahu anhu. Some of the other madhabs that don't make it throughout time, or kind of exist but sort of and sort of not, a lot of it is because the transmission is not full. What's the problem with the transmission? Well, other than the fact that it could be open to doubt, there's that theoretical possibility. This is another problem, is that, then we don't know what's the order. So how do we know if this is exactly what Imam al-Awza'i said, or what Layth ibn Sa'd said, or some other mujtahid? So knowing the order or the chronology of the positions of the madhabs is very, very important. And of course, the latter text is going to abrogate, even if it's transmitted through an ahad transmission. And then he says, radiallahu anhu, وَالْأَصَحُ أَنَّ الْعَمَلَ بِالْمُتَعَارِضَيْنِ وَلَوْ مِنْ وَجْهٍ أَوْلَى مِنْ إِلْغَاءِ أَحَدِهِمَا وَأَنَّهُ لَا يُقَدَّمُ الْكِتَابُ عَلَى السُنَّةِ وَلَا عَكْسُهُ. The dominant opinion is that acting on the opposing text is better than canceling them. So it's better to make the effort and act rather than to cancel them altogether, because then we could be leaving something that's important on the table. The Quran is not advanced over the Sunnah, neither the opposite. Neither is the Sunnah advanced over the Quran. Now, that doesn't mean that there can't be some issue of abrogation, but we're saying that we're always trying to reconcile. We're always trying to build and to use both, not to cancel one over the other. So for us, the Sunnah is a form of revelation, because the Prophet ﷺ doesn't speak of his own, but the narration and the construction, or what's human speech, of course, and then the way that the Sunnah arrives at us It's the same way that the Quran arrives us through narration, but not all of the Sunnah is at the level of tawatur, as we know. The vast majority of the Sunnah is ahad. فإن تعذر العمل. Let me just read this last sentence completely and then we'll translate it. فإن تعذر العمل فإن علم المتأخر فناسخ وإلا رجع إلى مرجح فإن تعذر فإن عفوا نعم فإن تعذر فإن لم يتقارن وقبل النسخ طلب غيرهما وإلا تخير إن تعذر الترجيح. He says rahimahullah, if it is impossible to act, if the latter text is known, then it is the abrogator. If not, then one is given preference over the other. If this can't be done, and they are both at the same time texts, but can accept abrogation, then one chooses between the two if preference can't be done. So, it's a lot of order there, but basically, the cleanest thing is that we know that A abrogates B or B abrogates A. Clean, we know that we're going to follow the abrogator, the nasikh. If we don't know which one is nasikh or which one is not, then you have to prefer one over the other. You have to do tarjih. You have to find which one is a stronger proof. If you can't, but it is possible that they can both be nasikh and mansukh, in other words, they're not concurrent, then you have to choose between one of the two if you can't make the preference. So, in all circumstances, basically what he's saying is we're going to do our best to follow the text. We're not going to leave anything. We're going to follow it because, this deals with halal and haram and deals with reward in this life and consequences, Allah Ta'ala save us all, consequences in the hereafter. So this is not something that we're going to take lightly, that we're going to do our best to act when we can. Okay. That's kind of pretty much what I wanted to do for today. I don't want to venture anymore, but I just will say some sort of final things in passing is that as some of this might seem logical, but it is very important. All of these sections, every book of Usul al-Fiqh is very important, but this one is super, super important because this is now we are moving away from the theory into the action. This is actually what happens with the ijtihad. This is actually part of the process of ijtihad. Even though there's a separate book and section for ijtihad, this is how it starts. You have to prefer something over the other. And that's where all of the differences of opinion come from. It really comes from how you weight the evidence and how you investigate. He's going to get into that in the next two lectures. We're going to talk about chains of transmission and the strength of a language, the Qurashi language versus non-Qurashi language. We're going to get into all those details. But this is super important, so I want you to kind of experience and feel with me that we are like now transitioning from theory to actual practice. Insha'Allah, wallahu ta'ala a'la wa a'lam, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam. Alhamdulillah, in today's lecture we were able to begin book 6, which is giving preference to proofs. So now we are moving from the theory of usul al-fiqh, its definition and theory, to now the action of ijtihad, the actual action of putting all of this stuff together and coming up with rules and deductions, so on and so forth. So in today's lecture we kind of introduced the concept of giving preference to proof, and we talked about what can contradict and what cannot contradict one another. And then we talked about what happens if there is an internal contradiction with a certain imam, like in our case Imam Shafi'i, if either we know the chronology of what he said, so therefore the latter one abrogates the former one, but in about 15, 16, 17 cases, we do not know that. So how do we give preference? Another issue related to that is if the imam made ijtihad on an issue and was silent on another issue that's similar, we do ilhaq or we do ijtihad in inter-madhab qiyas, and we cast the ruling on the new issue and we attribute this to the imam partially, not absolutely, because there is a bit of our human effort involved in that. And then we started to look at what tarjih is, which is giving preference to one proof over another, and obviously we have to act on that which we find to be the stronger proof. However, there is no preference of proofs when it comes to absolute text, so you're not going to prefer one of the Quran over the other, and we do not prefer the Quran over the Sunnah or the Sunnah over the Quran, but rather we take both And then the last sort of section that we talked about was when we have difficulty in two opposing texts and we don't know if and when there was abrogation, we are going to always do our best to follow something. So we have to give preference. There has to be you have to prefer one or the over the other, one meaning over the other, and this is where the ijtihad really comes into play, and also where there is a birth of multiple legal positions, because a lot of times the evidence, pieces of evidence are on the table, but you got to put them together and prefer one over the other, and that's how we can come to different positions. And then inshallah we'll continue the discussion in the next class, which all of this will be clear with multiple examples. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, wa sallallahu ala Sayyidina Mawlana Muhammad wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa sallam.